West is not as kind of these tectonic plates which are some sort of colliding with each other, but really an abbreviation for complex heterogeneous entities which are being policed and with very fuzzy boundaries. And those boundaries, and drawing on those boundaries, is what creates the conflict. And in this current situation, the conflict is being created for particular reasons, that there is a tension that people do feel in terms of Islam and the West.
So you don't think it necessarily has been fired by the long fuse over the last 900 years? I'm exaggerating and simplifying just
sure.
Because this is a conversation, but you don't see that. You see it as something much more inflamed by the last 30, 40, 50 years.
I'd say probably the last 100 years or so, I mean, last 70 years. I think that isn't to deny that historical thing that I was talking about. I think that exists. But it's a bit like saying that, for example, what happens when Germany and England play football, suddenly memories of the Second World War are evoked. And between that doesn't mean that constantly, you know, Germany and England are always, in conflict with each other. I mean, previous to the First World War, the royal family in Germany and Britain were actually quite close in many ways. So it seems to me what we're seeing is how memories are being used to give depth to conflict rather than the actual historical record, which is actually very mixed.
William Dalrymple, what do you see as the source of the tension? And could, as Hamza brought in the historical perspective, we can bring in the idea, the notion, the fact that for several hundred years the Islamic scholars took over Hellenistic learning, they transferred it to the West. Without those 600 or 700 years, the Western Renaissance would not have been possible. They carried through and improved on and refined and changed algebra, mathematics, astronomy, all sorts of medicine, and so on and so forth. So you very much see an intertwined population, a great vision of Cordoba with Jews, Christians and Muslims learning together in this great city of the Middle Ages. So in one sense you could say, well, this is strange. They were doing okay with each other.
I think you can easily overemphasize the crusader, the conflictual element in the relationship between Islam and Christianity. Certainly it was there. But there have been so many periods when the two have come together peacefully. And in many of the great periods of the most sublime literature, the most technological sophistication have happened in those points of contact. In Islamic Spain, you mentioned, Islamic Sicily. And it's a two-way process, too. I think it's very important to remember Islam's debt to Christianity. Islam grew up in what was then a Christian Near East. And a lot of the very basic conventions of Islam come from Christianity. Ramadan, which at first seems a very alien, Islamic, foreign practice, is in fact nothing more than the Islamicization of Lent. If you see how Eastern Christians fast during Lent, they do the all-day sunrise to sunset, not touching food or drink. The Islamic way of praying with its prostrations is very, very close to the pre-Islamic Syrian Orthodox way, which if you go today to Eastern Turkey, you see them bowing and prostrating in pewless churches that look exactly like mosques. And this goes on and over and over again. Minarets, the first minarets are square church towers in Syria. So it isn't just a situation of conflict, and it isn't just a one-way stream from Islam to the West. It's a very deep and intertwined relationship. The only thing I ever learnt about Islam at school, even though I did both theology and history, was the Crusades. That was the only time I ever came into contact with it. And I think it's very important to see that this is a very complex and very intertwined relationship.
Jonathan Friedland, can I come to you now to answer the same question, really? Where do you see the causes and the sources of the clash? What historical roots do you find, if you find any?
Well, I think they are there, but I feel about this whole relationship that there's something sort of unrequited about it. There's something imbalanced about it, and it relates to something that William was saying about the absence of Islam from his own schooling and from mine as well. And something Hamza was saying too about how the Islamic world seems more aware of history than people in the West. And maybe the result is that what you get is this sense that from we're hearing across the Arab and Muslim world now a sense of clash or conflict with the West, that the West is against it, which has a whole lot of historical evocations, just as you were saying, that can be stirred up, either going back 900 years in the Crusades, a few hundred years ago to the turn back of the Ottoman Empire outside the gates of Vienna, or the last century of colonialism. So they can feel as if there is a series here, a pattern here, a historical tension between West and Islam, whereas I feel on the Western side, actually, there's nothing like that, partly because of ignorance. People just haven't thought about Islam that much. They're not really that aware of these centuries of history. And in an odd way, you'd think, well, maybe perhaps that's a benign thing. In a funny way, that's almost part of the problem, because there's a lack of respect contained in that, because it doesn't even regard Islam as this sort of equal enemy, yes, let alone as an equal. Yes. And so there's something, I feel, of surprise in the way the West has reacted to this. What have you got against us? Yes. And you hear it in both President Bush and Tony Blair when they say Islam's a peaceful religion, we don't have any grievance against it, not thinking, well, how does it look at the other end of the telescope?
Yes.
So there's something of the unrequited, not exactly love affair between these two.
It's a really good point, because I think, I don't think people understand the extent of humiliation that the Muslim world has and in fact Osama bin Laden mentioned that. We've been living in humiliation for 80 years. And I think the aggression of the Nazi Germany was a result of the humiliation that had occurred after World War I, the Versailles Treaty, the humiliation of the German people. I think it's, in a sense, a testimony to the patience of the Muslim nations that they really have felt this incredible humiliation. Another aspect of it is that the Muslims were a very successful religion. Islam was an imperial force almost right from the start. The Muslims are not comfortable with being objects. They've been subjects of history throughout the vast majority of Islamic history. And I would like to add one other thing about the fact that we are post-Christian in our worldview. Generally, the cosmology of the West is secular humanist. And I think that while Muslims see a crusade, it's not so much a religious crusade, it's more of a commercial crusade. Because I think instead of sending missionaries now, the West tend to send McDonald's executives to set up accounts in the Muslim world. So
Can I come to you, Salman, now, just to maybe draw, perhaps to a close, the longer historical perspective, though. After the Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment, again, this is broad, Western society became notably more secular, science, the idea of progress, and revolutions had taken place, a political revolution towards democracy, the industrial revolution, the religious revolution towards each man can seek his God in his own way, intellectual revolution, Darwin turned the world upside down, that sort of thing. Is there a feeling that Islam did not, having been, as it were, equal, I'm sorry about the simplicity of this, in about 1700, 1750, is there a sense in which by not participating in that, there was something of what Jonathan was saying, somehow they dropped out of the picture?
I think one of the things you've got to remember is this, that when the Enlightenment took place, and when you talk about all of this kind of major transformation which Europe undertook to industrialization, to this kind of modernized society that we more or less understand now, there weren't many people, not just among Muslims, but Chinese, Indians, who actually took it seriously in the first instance. I mean, you've got so many kind of accounts of these clockworks and gadgets being sent to these courts of the Chinese emperor, and then sending them back. What use are they to us? So the first thing is that it wasn't that obvious that something major had happened. Secondly, and what happened is this, once it became very clear that this technical revolution had really changed the relationship of power in the world within Europe, I think Europeans came to worry about how to explain this. And like most successful people, you tend to see this in terms of your own virtues. So the quest for the European miracle now turned upon what was it so specific about Europe? Was it found in its culture? Was it found in its geology? I mean, all of these accounts have been written which have tried to explain this transformation. And in the end, what the effect of these stories have been is to exclude the possibility of anyone else imitating it, because the idea was that what happened in Europe was due to the unique circumstances of Europeanness, and the only way that people could do this is by actually imitating Europeanness. And that in itself already set up a frontier between what people had to decide. So to be modern, you had to become European eventually. And that's why, for example, you have Mustafa Kemal introducing an act banning you were wearing the fez. Somehow there's a relationship with the headgear that you wear in iron and steel production. Now obviously it sounds absurd to us, but this is seriously believed, that somehow if you don't imitate Europeanness, whatever that may mean, it's a very complicated term, you will not be able to achieve whatever Europe has achieved.
What you're hearing there, I think, is the roots of what is a current problem there seemed to be only one model of modernization in the world, that to be in the 21st century was to globalize, to get McDonald's and Nike and the rest of it. And so you have globalization seem to mean only Americanization. And when people say now, for example, oh no, there could be an Islamic model of capitalism, democracy, etc., people think that's either a joke or they think there's just a blank space there because no one is yet used to, and maybe the roots of it is what Salman's saying, an alternative non-Western, non-American model of modernization.
Well, I'd like to just come to the end of this part with Hamza Yusuf. Is there something in the notion of modernization that seems to be incompatible with Islam, or is that just a way we're reading it?
I think what happens is modernization in the Muslim world is interpreted as westernization. And that's where you get a serious conflict. Islam, in no means, I think, has a problem with the achievements of human beings. However, I think that in some ways, in the West, achievements have been seen in this scientific milieu of progress, in a sense, abandoning religion. I think a lot of our scientists see it as that we're moving into a stage beyond religion, whereas for the Muslim, science and religion, in a sense, science is constrained by religion. And so it sees that there's a real humanistic impulse in Muslims to make sure that science is to benefit humanity.
Is there a sense in which we have got, as Jonathan said earlier in the discussion actually, we think we're sending out one message where another is going out. We think the West is sending out a message of freedom, equality, democracy, fine living, women's rights and so on. And in fact, what is being received is decadence, mere consumerism.
Propping up horrible regimes.
Yeah, propping up horrible regimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we may well get onto, but the experience of globalization or modernization in Arab and Muslim countries is not how we might imagine it could be. I mean, the writer Farid Zakaria has talked about a globalization you can see, but you can't touch, meaning that what you have is, yes, the exploitation and the sweatshops and the McDonald's, perhaps, but you don't have the rule by law, perhaps freedom of expression, multi-party democracies. You don't have the things that we regard as basic. And so what you see is, yes, there's corrupting influences, the things that many of us regard as the price, the downside of our own liberties and modern freedoms. They seem to be, it seems to me, having some of the price and none of the benefits.
I think it's even more sort of extreme than that. I think one of the effects of colonialism demonstrated that you could have liberal democracy at home and tyranny abroad. I mean, the colonial empires were most of the times at the same time where you had certain kind of democratization in Europe, in societies. So the fact that you can have this, idea of democracy and then have tyranny abroad is something that isn't inexplicable for most people in the Muslim world.
Muslims have really, I think that's a really important point that Salman's making. One of the signs that I saw several times in Pakistani things, human rights for you and tyranny for us. And that is a definite feeling in the Muslim world, is that there's a type of hypocrisy or double standard that the West plays. On the one hand, it espouses all of these wonderful Enlightenment ideas, which are in fact, more often than not, very compatible with traditional Islamic understanding. They really are, if people understand the Islamic tradition.
We've got to take a break for a couple of minutes and we're back to continue this discussion. Hello, in part two we'll look at the internal dynamic of Islam. I'll start again with you, Hamza. You said that Islam was hijacked on September the 11th on that plane as an innocent victim. So do you think it's a mistake to associate this attack with Islam?
I think that what I really meant by that is what happens when religion is used in the West for extremist purposes. For instance, even in Japan with the Buddhist sect that use sarin gas, I think nobody in the West, because there's a general knowledge that Buddhism is a pacifist religion, nobody associated that with Buddhists. They just saw it as a freak incident. I think the same is true in America. There are terrorist activities done by extremist Christians, abortion clinics that are bombed, things like that. Nobody in the West associates those with Christianity because they know that generally Christianity does not teach that. Whereas unfortunately, because there's such profoundly deep misconceptions about Islam, when these events do occur, many people in the West do in fact regard these events to be somehow intrinsic to the Islamic military.
But there is an explanation for that, which is that you're right about the abortion clinic case, but if then the streets of Christian countries were filled with demonstrators wielding placards saying, we support the person person who organised this, he's our hero, he's our champion, bearing his face on placards, people would then think, oh, I see, there is some read across from the motives of these people to the wider Christian world. You'd begin to think there's a link. Equally, if those Christians who destroyed the abortion clinics were not denounced by Christianity's leading clerics, who did not say, this is nothing to do with us, who did not gather in some formal convocation to formally ostracize the perpetrators of that, then you'd begin to think maybe there's some link. And my worry about the Islamic world is that